Good evening, everyone. I'm Tricia Mims, the Director of National Park Partners, and I'd like to welcome you to our third and final installment of our 17th annual Moccasin Bend Lecture Series. Thank you for being here, both here in person at the IMAX and virtually. We have dozens joining us on Zoom. This series was created in 2006 by longtime advocate for national parks and now current member of the Tennessee House of Representatives, Mr. Greg A. Vidal. Through his generous sponsorship, the lecture series is offered free to the public every year and features 3 speaking events with subject matter experts sharing insights on topics related to national parks and conservation, indigenous culture and history, and Chattanooga's place in the U.S. Civil War. Tonight, we conclude our 2022 series with Mr. James Ogden, historian at Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. Locally, your park is an amazing historical and cultural resource, offering over 9,000 acres and 80 miles of trails to explore, spanning 2 states and across 6 distinct places filled with a 12,000-year history that shaped the very fabric of our city, our region, and our nation. Your national park is not only a major contributor to our quality of life here in the Chattanooga area, it's a major driver of our local economy as well. More than 950,000 visitors came to Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park in 2021 alone, providing an economic impact exceeding $80 million. We encourage area residents to take advantage of the many ways to connect to the national park with ranger-led programming that takes place throughout the year, including the upcoming commemorative programs planned for the 159th anniversary of the Battles for Chattanooga later this month. With us tonight is Park Superintendent Brad Bennett. Please join me in thanking Brad and the National Park Service for their dedication to the stewardship, interpretation, and preservation of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. Now I would like to introduce Greg A. Vidal, founder and sponsor of the Moccasin Bend Lecture Series. Greg is a true champion of conservation, a board member and the first local landowner to preserve his beautiful farm with the Land Trust for Tennessee. Greg has visited around 350 National Park Service sites and recently served as president of the National Parks Conservation Association. He has been a steadfast and generous supporter, first of the Friends of Moccasin Bend and the Friends of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park, and now of National Park Partners, formed when the 2 groups combined. Among his many awards and recognitions, Greg was the recipient in 2008 of the highest honor of the former Friends of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park, the Drew Haskins Jr. Award of Merit. Greg recently won election to the Tennessee legislature, where he serves the 29th district in the House of Representatives. Greg?
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you all for being here. As Tricia said earlier, tonight is the third in our series for this season, completing 17 years of this Moccasin Bend Lecture Series. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, because he always reminds me, that Mom hasn't missed a single one in 17 years, and she's with us tonight. Over the years, we've had a variety of subjects. This year, we've been blessed to have touched on some fascinating history and background about the Eastern Band, and also about DeSoto and early exploration in Southeast Tennessee. Tonight, we're fortunate to have our historian at Chickamauga Chattanooga National Military Park, Jim Ogden, with us, and Tricia will formally introduce him, but I just scratch my head and wonder, I've heard Jim speak 25 years almost, and he still has a new story for us, so I hope they're all factual. Jim tells some interesting theories and stories, and I know they're based on diaries, and he keeps finding those diaries. So he tells us that at 4 a.m. on the 17th of October in 1863, Captain Williams heard a noise, and he'll tell you the rest in a few minutes. But thank you for being here. We'll look forward to a wonderful evening, and thank you for supporting our national park and Chickamauga Chattanooga National Military Park. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Ogden. A Maryland native, Jim began working with the National Park Service in 1982 at Chickamauga and Chattanooga before transferring to Russell Cave National Monument in Bridgeport, Alabama, and Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park in Virginia. In November 1988, he returned to Chickamauga and Chattanooga as the staff historian, the position he currently holds. He speaks regularly on aspects of the Civil War to historical organizations across the eastern half of the United States, including many Civil War roundtables, and periodically takes groups to Shiloh, Perryville, Stones River, some of the Atlanta campaign sites, and Franklin and Nashville. He has taught Civil War history courses at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, including a Civil War and Reconstruction course, and has appeared on the History Channel's Civil War Journal and Civil War Combat, and PBS's History Detectives, as well as on C-SPAN. Since 1986, he has been an instructor for over 600 groups of officers of the U.S. Army conducting staff rides, which are in-depth analysis of historical military events, at Chickamauga and Chattanooga. For a decade, his staff ride clients even included 200 to 600 officers annually from the British Army's Joint Services Command and Staff College. Jim is the recipient of many awards and recognitions for his contributions to Civil War history and preservation. To highlight just two, he, like Greg, received the Friends of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park Drew Haskins Jr. Memorial Award and the Department of the Army's Superior Public Service Medal in 2019. Jim and his wife Laura and their son James live in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jim Ogden.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank the National Park Partners for inviting me to speak tonight, and I'm happy to do that. You all, both the earlier Friends of Chickamauga Chattanooga National Military Park and the Friends of Moccasin Bend National Park have all done important work in helping to forward the mission of the National Military Park to preserve and tell the story of the nationally significant history that happens here in this region. And Greg, thank you in particular for supporting this lecture series now for 17 years. So. Moccasin Bend, of course, is one of the most distinctive features in our area. It appears in the city seal as well as in other forms around the city. Not only is it distinctive, but it is also quite scenic. And in recent years, its history, and thanks in large part to such organizations as the Friends of Moccasin Bend, but also the history of Moccasin Bend has really begun to receive attention in the last 40 years now, basically, with the work of Dr. Major C.R. McCullough and the Chattanooga Regional Anthropological Association. And then the creation of the Friends of Moccasin Bend, the work of Lawrence Alexander and Doug Cubison, and so many others. And certainly, the attention to Moccasin Bend's Civil War history is something that has come out of this work of the last now roughly 4 decades. Moccasin Bend is not just a distinctive feature, but we also now know that it is indeed a salient point in the story of the struggle for Chattanooga during our nation's terrible, tragic, but utterly transformative Civil War. Moccasin Bend, of course, along with Lookout Mountain, is one of the distinctive features of this region. And so its existence, even at the time of the Civil War, would be something that was noted. This Harper's Weekly image, actually we can say this is an intelligence image. Harper's Weekly was published in New York City, but this image is of Chattanooga in Confederate occupation in the summer of 1863. And the artist may have been one of the intelligence sources for the Union Army as it planned its campaign to capture Chattanooga. That's in that summer of 1863. As that planning went on, the intelligence gathered about the region was reflected in many ways in the Union effort, including a series of detailed maps of the prospective area of operation. and this particular one that shows the immediate Chattanooga area, and when you zoom in, you can see a representation of Moccasin Bend. Clearly evident there, but notice some of the details that are not quite right. Notice where Browns Ferry is shown on this map. What is marked as Browns Ferry on this map is actually the site of an old ferry, long out of use, at the mouth of Lookout Creek. But if you look downstream or to the north, you'll see Williams Ferry, which essentially is located where historic Browns Ferry would be. But while those bits of inaccuracy exist, notice at the tip of Lookout Mountain the reference to bluffs. The abrupt end of Lookout Mountain, rising more than 300 feet, nearly vertically above the Tennessee River, and perched right there at the top of the bluff is the main wartime road over the tip of Lookout Mountain. And Stringer's Ridge, ending or beginning there near the southern end of Moccasin Bend. It was already at least generally known when the Union Army advance began in mid-August. And of course, that advance was announced to Chattanooga when Union artillery, under the command of Eli Lilly, began to shell Chattanooga on August 21st, a day of fasting, prayer, and humiliation in the Confederacy, when the leading lights of the Confederate Army of Tennessee and the city of Chattanooga at that time were in church, awaiting to hear sermons on that designated fast day. That first firing was from Stringer's Ridge due north of Chattanooga across the Tennessee River. But in the days after, as the Union advanced towards Chattanooga and into the region continued, Lilly's gunners returned repeatedly to Stringer's Ridge and eventually even fired from Stringer's Ridge on Moccasin Bend across the river and into the southern portion of the city of Chattanooga. And then as the Confederates evacuated the city on September the 7th, 8th, and 9th, and Union forces closed in to potentially occupy the abandoned city of Chattanooga, Lilly's battery, supported by Wilder's brigade of mounted infantry, were attentive of the approach of Union forces. And on the 9th day of September, when gunfire was heard on the slopes of Lookout Mountain, Lilly's gunners moved to the south end of Stringer's Ridge and joined into that fight for a time, even landing shells amongst the Union troops who were advancing into or onto Lookout Mountain that afternoon. The Confederates, of course, do indeed evacuate the city of Chattanooga on that September the 9th, and the Union Army will occupy it. And 10 days later, the two armies will clash in the Battle of Chickamauga, a dozen miles to the south of the city of Chattanooga. And it's with the Union defeat at Chickamauga and their retreat into Chattanooga that Moccasin Bend really will take on its importance in the struggle for Chattanooga. The Union Army retreating from the Chickamauga battlefield on the afternoon of and evening of September the 19th will first take up positions at Rossville Gap in Missionary Ridge and across Chattanooga Valley. We're fortunate to have a series of very valuable maps produced by the Park Commission when it is established in the 1890s to document the campaign, and this is one of the maps. And after spending the 21st of September at Rossville Gap, William Stark Rosecrans, the Union Army commander, will order his troops to withdraw into the city of Chattanooga itself. And they'll begin to build a series of fortifications enclosing essentially a 1 square mile area in the bend of the Tennessee River, enclosing just the small city of Chattanooga as it was then existing. But as they withdrew into Chattanooga, potentially surrendering Lookout Mountain to Confederate occupation, William Stark Rosecrans was very cognizant of his need to defend the recently won city of Chattanooga, and was alive to the possibilities that the terrain offered. The hairpin bend of the Tennessee River, the Moccasin Bend, offered the opportunity to turn the landform within that bend, often at the time then called Moccasin Point, into a fortified point that jutted out towards the potential Confederates who would be confronting the Union Army in Chattanooga. Rosecrans quickly himself recognized these opportunities. He'll even himself go out on Moccasin Bend to lay his eyes on the scene. And early on September the 22nd, he will, through his staff, order the first body of troops out onto Moccasin Bend. Reserve Corps Commander Gordon Granger is directed to send a brigade of infantry from the Reserve Corps across the Tennessee River from Chattanooga and onto Moccasin Bend, and to specifically, as the order indicates, to occupy the heights opposite the point of Lookout Mountain. The brigade designated is the brigade commanded by Walter Childs Whitaker. Whitaker was a then 40-year-old Kentuckian, an attorney from the Shelbyville, Kentucky area, a Mexican War veteran, and a man who had been a member of the Kentucky legislature, a state senator in 1861, and a man who had played a prominent role in helping to keep the state of Kentucky in the Union and to end Kentucky's effort to remain neutral as the nation had divided. In late 1861, Whitaker would leave the Kentucky legislature and take command of the 6th Kentucky Infantry, will fight at the Battle of Shiloh, and then in 1863 be appointed a brigadier general and be given a brigade within the Reserve Corps. One of his biographers will describe Whitaker as a man of ardent spirits and a man not unfamiliar with ardent spirits. And there are more than one references to perhaps Whitaker consuming maybe a little too much ardent spirit. But Whitaker's Reserve Corps Brigade will participate in the Battle of Chickamauga on its final day on September the 20th, having marched south with another brigade of the Reserve Corps and arriving in time to fight with George Thomas on Snodgrass Hill. This is the position where the Whitaker Brigade markers stand along the Snodgrass Hill line today on the Chickamauga battlefield. That brigade, normally made up of the 96th Illinois, 115th Illinois, 40th Ohio Infantry, and 84th Indiana Infantry regiments, was supplemented at Chickamauga by the attachment of 2 other regiments, the 22nd Michigan and the 89th Ohio. But the morning after the Battle of Chickamauga, the remains of the 89th Ohio would be unattached from Whitaker's brigade. Their normal artillery battery, the 18th Ohio Battery, and so those 5 infantry regiments and the 18th Ohio Battery, as well as the 10th Indiana Battery from the 21st Corps, will be the troops who were first sent out onto Moccasin Bend. With the 2 attached regiments, Whitaker's brigade at Chickamauga had been almost 2,700 men in strength, and it had suffered 1,271 casualties. With the detachment of the 89th Ohio and also the loss of about another 100 men in the withdrawal from Missionary Ridge on the evening of the 21st, and some stragglers at the time when Whitaker's men marched into the city that morning to head towards the bridge to cross the Tennessee River. It may have numbered only about 1,000 men strong, but it would rise once again with the attachment of the 10th Indiana Battery, as well as the return of some of the slightly wounded and some of the stragglers, to about 1,500 men soon thereafter. As they marched through Chattanooga, it was a scene of confusion, and it was also a scene of trauma. The town was full of wounded. One member of the brigade said all the churches and other public buildings and many dwellings in Chattanooga were converted into hospitals. Many of the wounded had no shelter of any kind, but were left lying on the ground in the front yards of residences or wherever most convenient to unload them from ambulances and wagons. A lieutenant was left all night on a stretcher near the walk leading to a dwelling temporarily used as a hospital, supposed to be mortally wounded and certain to die before morning. But he survived the cold and neglect and showed sufficient signs of life to attract attention on the morning of the 22nd. And he was ordered to be taken into the house and given proper care. And strange to say, he recovered from it all and may yet be living to tell the story. They marched down to Ross's Landing, crossed the trestle bridge that had been constructed, and then turned westward and marched out on to Moccasin Bend. The 115th Illinois will, along with 2 guns from the 18th Ohio Battery, will be positioned at Brown's Ferry itself to guard that vital crossing of the river, but the rest of the brigade will march south towards the very tip of Moccasin Point. In addition to the Park Commission maps, we are fortunate to have the product of a team of U.S. Coast Survey officers who were sent here to assist the Union Army in that fall of 1863. And as you quickly look at this map, you may notice that something seems odd about it. Most maps are oriented with north towards the top of the map. This map is oriented with north essentially at the bottom of the map. And it has confused a lot of people over the time, including one of the map makers. But that's a little detail that's too much to get into tonight. And I've often wondered, why is the map drawn from this perspective? It's entirely possible the engineers began drawing this map before they had much access to the area. And from a hill like Cameron Hill or another hill of Stringer's Ridge, this would have been their perspective of Moccasin Bend and the northern tip of Lookout Mountain. But to orient the map a little more like we would be used to it, we'll twist it around just a little bit and get Moccasin Bend above the point of Lookout Mountain. On Moccasin Bend, at the southern end of Stringer's Ridge, on the tops of those hills will become the primary positions. Initially, the 2 batteries, as well as Whitaker's men, were positioned right along the riverbank. But when Confederate forces occupied Lookout Mountain on September the 24th, they gained the advantage of heights from the bluff of Lookout Mountain. And so the orders were quick to be issued that the men of Whitaker's brigade, and particularly the 2 batteries, to pull back and find better positions from which to then fire at their opponents across the river on Lookout Mountain. On the easternmost hill, the highest hill at the southern end of Stringer's Ridge, the 10th Indiana Battery will be positioned. And even with the size of this map tonight here, you may not be able to clearly see, but there are the symbols for fortifications or earthworks within that circle on the map. And on the next hill crest to the west, the 18th Ohio Battery will be positioned. And more evident there is the symbol for the earthworks. The 10th Ohio Battery, or excuse me, 10th Indiana Battery, taking position on the top of its hill there as its primary location. That is the hill where today the now abandoned police radio tower stands. And unfortunately, in the construction of that piece of civic infrastructure in the 1970s, the earthworks there were pushed down to facilitate the construction of the radio tower. One of the most challenging things to photograph is earthworks, particularly in the woods. And so what is not real evident in this picture is the kind of bowl-like depression there near the center, where the earth from the earthworks has been pushed down. But some previous members of the Friends of Moccasin Bend National Park, and who now tragically are no longer with us, Pope Holliday and Reese Buttram, many of you all knew. Both of them saw those works early on before they were disturbed, and one of them described the works as being about head high. That was Reese. And the other one described the works as being about shoulder high. That was Pope. Some of you all know why the difference of head and shoulder, Pope being the taller of the two. But positioned here were guns of the 10th Indiana Battery, and Corporal David Blodgett of the battery will write, our battery was ordered across the Tennessee River, and we went down to the extreme point of the Moccasin opposite Lookout Mountain. The next morning, the enemy opened on us with artillery in our position. We were unable to do them any damage, and so moved back out of range to choose position. Our commander, Captain Naylor, having the choice. My section, 2 guns, Lieutenant L. Cox commanding, took the highest point, here where the police radio tower is today, where it could command all the territory from Lookout Mountain to Missionary Ridge. Lieutenant Alf Costner took position to our right, about 200 yards distance. We immediately commenced fortifying under charge of the Engineer Corps. The 22nd Michigan took position between our 2 sections on the natural ridge. The 84th Indiana was to our right and rear. In a few days, our works were in condition to commence operations. Lieutenant Cox ordered us to open fire on the enemy and see if we could draw them out. We succeeded admirably and had a nice little artillery duel. Nobody was hurt on our side, though the rebel shot exploded and struck all around us. Those will be just the first of a ongoing artillery duel with the Confederate gunners on Lookout Mountain. One portion of that earthwork complex survives largely intact today, a portion that faces towards the city. Guns positioned to be able to fire across the river and potentially into the flank of any Confederates who might attack into Chattanooga from south to north. That position of Costner's section, a little bit to the east or to the right of Cox's, is the most distinctive of the earthworks that survived today there. You can clearly see the position of the 2 guns located here. And in the wintertime, when the leaves are off of the trees and the sun is lighting up the northern tip of Lookout Mountain, you can clearly see how those guns could command the slopes of the mountain across the river. The 18th Ohio Battery took position on that next rise to the east. That battery, from the Gallipolis area of Ohio, is commanded by Captain Charlie Christopher Alshire. That battery of 3-inch ordnance rifles initially is split with some of its guns down at Brown's Ferry, but they will build positions for the full battery here on the hill immediately overlooking the entrance to the Moccasin Bend State Mental Health Hospital today. Clearly evident again are the embrasures, the openings in the earthworks through which the guns would have fired. The Confederate observers on Lookout Mountain suggesting that the earthworks were so extensive that it was as if the muzzles of the guns were just peeking out of the earth to fire up at Lookout Mountain. Alshire himself will write in a letter on September the 27th, Mountain Lookout was evacuated by our forces a few nights since, and since its occupation is not of much consequence to us. It is now infested with rebels whose signal flag can be distinctly seen from where I write. They planted 2 guns on the side of Lookout opposite Lieutenant Bierce's section the other evening, and let loose at us a few well-directed shots from one of our best gunners soon silenced them. Ours and their sharpshooters peg away at each other across the river at all times, day and night. Our men have the advantage of them, as we can go back of the hill to get water, while they have to come down to the river in full view, and not infrequently does their thirst for water cost them their lives. Movements are afoot, which will soon rid the mountain of the varmints. One of the potential positions of those Confederate guns attempting to silence the Moccasin Bend guns is what appears in this wartime photograph. This is along the old Walhatchee Pike, and part of this earthwork complex still survives there in the woods along the old Walhatchee Pike today. The Lieutenant Bierce that commands this part of the 18th Ohio Battery is the brother of Ambrose Bierce, the writer, and a man who was serving as a topographical engineer for William B. Hazen at the time of this campaign. Initially, there was a fair amount of sharpshooting across the river, but on September the 30th and October the 1st, there was a truce for the exchange of wounded between Braxton Bragg and William Stark Rosecrans, and the pickets thereafter informally continued that truce, and that type of sharpshooting diminished. But that Confederate signal station will draw the attention of the 18th Ohio Battery. To watch the Confederate signalmen wave their flags was annoying to the Union troops out on Moccasin Bend. And one lieutenant, an Englishman who had served in the English Army before the Civil War and before emigrating to the United States, who was then serving as an officer in an Ohio infantry regiment, had been assigned to the 18th Ohio Battery because the battery had lost 2 of its lieutenants in the Battle of Chickamauga. But Lieutenant John Marshall, who was a thorn in the side to Alshire, Marshall said that he could silence the battery. And after assuring authorities that he would not cause one of the guns to energetically disassemble, he was given permission to try, and after 3 shots caused the Confederate signal station to relocate. The guns located in their earthworks on the top of the hills of the southern end of Stringer's Ridge, firing less than a mile's distance across the river, command all the ground on the northern end of Lookout Mountain. Today, with the trees on Stringer's Ridge around the earthworks and the trees on the State Mental Health Hospital grounds, it's hard to understand and to illustrate just how these guns could command all of that ground. But in a mid-20th century photograph from Moccasin Bend across the river, taken before the hospital was constructed, we can get a little bit of that idea. This image showing how Lookout Mountain rises there in front of this Union position. At the base of Lookout Mountain ran the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. When it had been constructed in the 1850s, it had been given precedence over the use of ground at the base of Lookout Mountain, and the railroad had literally been squeezed in at the base of the rock bluff. And while a little hard to see in this image, just on the middle of the right edge of the image, you can see the bend of the Tennessee River, and you can see how the railroad occupies all of that space, preventing there being a road there past the mountain at essentially river level. And periodically, when the river was up, the railroad was down, underwater. There was the older road over Lookout Mountain, the old Federal Road. that actually was the longest, or most used corridor over the mountain for many years, formalized in the early 1800s in the agreement with the Cherokee Nation for a passageway across their lands between the United States in Georgia and the United States in Middle Tennessee. This old road, which also becomes known as the Jackson Road or Military Road, ran up through the area where Ruby Falls is today, and then on across the mountain and down onto the western side. It was still a pathway to some extent at the time of the Civil War, because Union General Joseph Hooker in the Battle of Lookout Mountain will talk about for a brief time riding on the old military road. There was also the ability to move over the tip of the mountain at the Cravens, at the level of the Cravens farmstead, higher up the mountain. Robert Cravens, the primary or a well-to-do Chattanooga industrialist, had established a farm in the 1850s on the northeastern tip of Lookout Mountain, had cleared about 100 acres of land and planted a large orchard, here evident in this late Civil War photograph, and built a home, which he called Alta Vista. In that mid-20th century photograph, the Cravens farmstead is largely grown up and not evident, but here in this image, you can see the part of the 100-acre clearing, the 10th Indiana Battery where that blue dot is, 18th Ohio Battery, and their guns capable of firing across the river and covering even that area, and even able to put projectiles through the Cravens house, which stood, past tense, stood, a different one than the one that is there today, there roughly where the X is. And the Cravens farmstead appears on the Coast Survey map as well. The 10th Indiana Battery, the 18th Ohio Battery, and then the clearing. But the most important route over the tip of Lookout Mountain was the Walhatchee Pike. Located or constructed after the removal of the Cherokee in 1838. The road was literally carved into the upper part of the bluff of the mountain overlooking the Tennessee River. And today, part of it is still trafficable by vehicles, but most of it is the old Walhatchee Pike Greenway that you can walk and get the sense that you were standing right on the edge of the bluff. In this photograph, again taken from Lookout Mountain to Moccasin Bend, that shows that Confederate artillery position. In the bottom edge of the picture, the rocks or stones that you see are on the Walhatchee Pike. This picture was not taken until after the Union Army in 1864 had expended tens of thousands of man-hours improving the Walhatchee Pike, as evidenced by the rocks that are here, but it gives some sense of how that road was just perched there along the top of the bluff and so easily potentially under the fire of the guns. One Confederate will write of a harrowing trip across Lookout Mountain on a foraging expedition. I was detailed one day to go after corn with a lot of others. Just before we got to the overhanging rock, we stopped in the bushes and dismounted, and one man would lead his horse and go across for fear the Yankees would shoot at them. This was a particularly open place on the road. We got across and got our sacks of corn and got to the place of the overhanging rock again on the return. And the man ahead of me was riding a mule and said he was going to ride across. So I gave him time to get across and then I started. As I came out into the open, there was that fellow His mule had shied at the open fall to the railroad and had jammed his sack of corn against the rock, and the sack had caught this fellow's leg against the saddle, and he could neither go forward nor backwards. And I was scared to death nearly. Up was hundreds of feet, perpendicular, and down was the same, and across the river I looked into the mouths of the guns. I looked every second to see the puff of smoke, but they didn't shoot. And then the man behind me came out, and there was 3 of us. About that time, I saw number 1 get his leg out, and he hit the ground running, and I was right behind him. I was detailed to go after corn the next day, but a boy who was on guard wanted to go and offered to swap places with me, and I needed no one to advise me, so I swapped and stood guard all day and night, on 2 hours and all 4. That was, or that PM, when the man got to that overhanging rock, the Yank shot a shell at him, but it struck about 10 feet above him, and he was not hurt. The 18th Ohio battery guns and the 10th Indiana battery guns cover all of these potential movement routes across the northern tip of the mountain and command all of that ground. And this would be some of the easiest and therefore most accurate artillery firing of the war, because literally they were shooting against something. They were not having to make a judgment about a distance to another spot on level ground to then be able to elevate their gun at the appropriate level. Here, they're just essentially pointing and shooting against a wall. The guns could even command part of the road leading up to the top of Lookout Mountain. Stationed out on the bend with the artillery and Whitaker's brigade was a signal corps detachment, and for a time that detachment included Captain Bradford Ripley Wood, Jr., the son of a former New York congressman, who was his father was then the United States ambassador to Denmark in the Lincoln administration. And one member of Wood's signal detachment was James Kelly. Both of these men are members of the 44th New York, not a regiment that fights out here, but they had been detached from their regiment in early 1862 to serve in the Union Signal Corps. And from the signal station on Stringer's Ridge on Moccasin Bend, they signaled by flag or torch to the signal station on Cameron Hill, and from there, their messages were sent by telegraph to Union Army headquarters in the Richardson House on Walnut Street. From the very beginning, it was known that rations were going to be short, at least for a time. And in the first days of the siege of Chattanooga, before the Confederates had occupied Lookout Valley with many troops, some of the Federals on Moccasin Bend were brazen enough to go across the river into Lookout Valley to forage for sweet potatoes and corn and other eatables. One of those foraging detachments included First Lieutenant Gid Utter of the 115th Illinois, and he would relate that in that expedition he was digging for sweet potatoes when they were suddenly surprised by some Confederate cavalry. A shot from the Confederate cavalry struck the bayonet that he was digging with, and that he happened at that particular moment to have his full body weight on, and he collapsed to the ground, but he quickly got up and began to run away, but was captured, but then used his daring to that evening escape his Confederate captors, and then get back across the river to Moccasin Bend. When closed off to foraging in in Lookout Valley or other points, and having scoured all of the corn from the fields on Moccasin Bend, the soldiers stationed there came to think of their position as starvation camp or starvation point. Union rations overall would get down to just a quarter ration for the men, and even down to essentially zero for the horses and mules. The 18th Ohio Battery and the 10th Indiana Battery had to send most of their horses west to the Bridgeport and Stevenson area, making the batteries then immobile on Moccasin Bend. But with the guns covering all of the routes over the northern tip of Lookout Mountain, it also meant that the Confederate force in Lookout Valley would be very limited. And this will be a key component in the Union effort to reopen the Tennessee River, to open a new supply line into Chattanooga. Union reinforcements having been sent by rail from Virginia, troops of the 11th and 12th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, coming under Joseph Hooker, had arrived out at Stevenson and Bridgeport, Alabama. And at the same time, Rosecrans and his engineers in Chattanooga had been constructing boats for floating military bridges, ponton bridges. And with those being available, the concept of a breakout and break-in was conceived, where the reinforcements that have arrived out at Stevenson and Bridgeport would march overland from Bridgeport towards Lookout Valley, while a Union force would use the pontoon boats and float down the Tennessee River under the cover of darkness and seize a point in Lookout Valley. They had noticed over the last couple of weeks that the number of Confederates in Lookout Valley had declined, that decline being the result of the effectiveness of the guns on Moccasin Bend, preventing the Confederates from supplying a larger number of troops. In fact, the Confederate force in Lookout Valley had basically started out as a brigade of 5 regiments, but 3 of the 5 regiments had been forced to move back to the east side of Lookout Mountain because of the inability to supply a 5-regiment sized force. This then left very few Confederates on station at any particular point along the river from Lookout Mountain downstream and into the Tennessee River Gorge, something that the Federals planned to take advantage of. During this time, William Stark Rosecrans will be removed from command of the Army of the Cumberland by the new overall Union commander for the military division of the Mississippi, the newly created geographical command within the United States Army, the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Ulysses S. Grant will be directed by President Abraham Lincoln, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck to come to Chattanooga and redeem the situation. Rosecrans and Grant not seeing eye to eye. Grant will relieve Rosecrans of command. The Army of the Cumberland goes to George Thomas. But as Grant comes to Chattanooga, he will encounter Rosecrans leaving Chattanooga at Stevenson, Alabama, where Grant learns of the plan to reopen the Tennessee River. And Grant will come on into Chattanooga, arriving on October the 23rd, be more fully briefed of the plan that night and the next day, and ordered it executed, or ordered it to be executed in the pre-dawn hours of October the 27th. And that morning, as the crews of the guns of the 18th Ohio Battery and the 10th Indiana Battery stood to their guns, a force of 1,400 Union soldiers of William B. Hazen's brigade would float down the Tennessee River in 50 pontoon boats and 2 flatboats and land at Brown's Ferry, the real Brown's Ferry, seizing it from Private Robert B. Payne of Company B of the 15th Alabama Infantry, the only Confederate on duty at Brown's Ferry. His fellow comrades who were supposed to be on duty with him were all comfortably asleep in the ferry keeper's cabin, represented by the log cabin that you see in Theodore Davis's woodcut here. But quickly, over 700 Union soldiers landed right here. Another 700 land a little bit further to the south, and they seize the Brown's Ferry, and then the engineers begin to construct a pontoon bridge across the Tennessee River to ensure Union hold of Brown's Ferry. The Confederates will make an effort to counteract this by ordering troops to march over the tip of Lookout Mountain from the east. And one of the South Carolinians sent that day, William R. Rankin, will relate of that Tuesday, the 27th of October. A little cloudy, and early in the morning we received orders to get ready to march at once. We got ready, fell in, and were soon moving towards the top of Lookout Mountain. Cautiously, by unbeaten paths, rough and deep and steep ravines, we slowly moved. Every few hundred yards, rest and wait. Nothing was at first severer than the rugged steeps upon us, for though the enemy threw several shells, we were protected by rocks and ravines which hid us from their view. But then there was an unavoidable place through which we had to pass, and then we were exposed to the enemy's batteries for several hundred yards, and but a short distance from, but above them. To pass this was the dread ordeal. We went in single file, but in quick succession, one after the other at the double quick. Shell fell thick and fast, but fortunately only one man of our regiment was slightly hurt, and none, we understood, in the other two regiments were hurt. Unable to march across the tip of Lookout Mountain on the Wauhatchie Pike, they had to climb up to the level of the Craven's house and even higher, almost literally up to the base of the rock bluff or palisades, before they could then start down the western side. But even then, as Rankin relates, under the fire of the guns on Moccasin Bend. It basically took all day to move about 4,500 Confederate soldiers into Lookout Valley, but by that time, there were an equal number of Union troops fortified at Brown's Ferry. And the Confederate effort to regain control of Lookout Valley would pass, particularly when the next day those Union reinforcements from Virginia under Hooker arrived in Lookout Valley, completing their march from Bridgeport. And with that link up, the little steamboats could begin to deliver supplies to Kelly's Ferry, and then the supplies be carried just 7 miles into Chattanooga. And Union rations, thanks to the Cracker Line, would begin to rise from the quarter ration to eventually, by the time of the fighting in November, about 3/4 of a ration. The Moccasin Bend guns will also play a role in the battles for Chattanooga, the events that we'll commemorate by the series of programs the weekend of the 19th and 20th, and on the actual anniversary dates of the 23rd, 24th, and 25th. In the battles for Chattanooga, initially Ulysses S. Grant had no intention of attacking the Confederates on Lookout Mountain. It just seemed far too formidable a position. But when the pontoon bridge at Brown's Ferry broke and trapped in Lookout Valley 2 divisions more than the one that Grant had intended to leave to hold Lookout Valley, he authorized Joseph Hooker to conduct a demonstration to fix the Confederates in place on Lookout Mountain. But when George Thomas relayed Grant's order to Hooker, Thomas had added, and if practicable, take the northern tip of Lookout Mountain. And the vain and egotistical Joseph Hooker, looking to redeem his reputation, latched on to that latter phrase and planned a true assault on Lookout Mountain, where he marched troops south in Lookout Valley to cross Lookout Creek at Light's Mill, and then climb up onto the side of the mountain about 3 miles south of the northern tip, and sweep from south to north on the west side of the mountain and around the northern tip. As part of this, Hooker also positioned artillery on the tops of the hills at the northwestern base of Lookout Mountain in Lookout Valley, and coordinated with Alshire's and Naylor's guns on Moccasin Bend to deliver converging artillery fire, even fire into the rear of the Confederates trying to defend the northern tip of Lookout Mountain. And as the map depicts, Hooker's men will march northward on the west side of the mountain and sweep around the northern tip of the mountain, keeping their right flank anchored against the base of the rock bluff or palisades, and their left against Lookout Creek and the Tennessee River itself. And as they sweep the Confederates around the northern tip of the mountain, Union artillery enfilading fire from Moccasin Bend, particularly fire delivered onto the Cravens farmstead, will prevent the Confederates from rallying in the fortifications that they had constructed there, and allow the Hooker's attacking force to sweep the Confederates through that open ground of the Cravens farm and into the woods south of there, and thereby open the passageways over the northern tip of Lookout Mountain to Union control. And it is with this attack of Joseph Hooker and the role that the Moccasin Bend artillery played that Moccasin Bend's role in the struggle for Chattanooga will essentially come to a close. The guns had done their duty. They had helped keep the Confederates at bay and then pry open the new supply route into Chattanooga and then pry the Confederate grasp from around Chattanooga. And just a few days after the Union success on Missionary Ridge on the 25th of November, 1863, Naylor and Alshire and the Union troops on Moccasin Bend received orders to abandon their positions and march in to the city of Chattanooga. And with no other Union troops stationed out on Moccasin Bend through the rest of the war, their now abandoned positions began to just deteriorate. And in some ways, this abandonment of these works in early December is what leaves them for us in such a pristine state today. There were once miles of earthworks around Chattanooga, and most of the other Union earthworks were reworked as Chattanooga became a Union base for the drive on down into Georgia. And even Fort Wood would not have looked the same in 1865 as it had in 1863 when it played its most important role. So today, as you visit the earthworks on Moccasin Bend, they actually still manifest much of the character that they would have had at the time that they played such a significant role in the story of our nation's Civil War that unfolded here in the shadow of Lookout Mountain. We have a physical remains as a basis to start a study of why Moccasin Bend is such a salient point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. Incredible always. We have time for some questions. If you're tuning in on Zoom, there's a Q&A feature. You can enter a question there, and I'll read it here after we take a couple from the audience. It's kind of hard to see.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Is it possible to get out to Moccasin Bend and see these earthworks?
It is. The question was whether it's possible to get out to Moccasin Bend to see these earthworks. It is. The majority of the National Park Service area on Moccasin Bend is open during daylight hours. And if you park legally, and that's basically the Blue Blazes parking area, the Blue Blazes Trail parking area, and then also enter the property legally. It is not proper to enter our property from the hospital grounds per se, because the hospital grounds are closed, but you can visit this earthwork complex. There's actually a series of old farm roads, which were even there at the time of the Civil War, that lead through those hills. A couple of times a year, we'll the National Military Park will lead tours out there. We are not doing one this November, however. I was directed to do something else out on Moccasin Bend this time, so not the earthworks, but maybe in the early part of 23 we'll lead a tour out there. So, but it is possible to see the complex. So.
Up there, sir?
Over here.
Yep.
How is it that you have not aged a day?
Oh, I have. So, so
It's the bright lights.
yeah, it is. It is harder to get up off of the floor these days. So.
Larry?
Jim, you remember when we did the review of Moccasin Bend from the Chattanooga side, John Brown and I,
Yep.
you, we were talking about the possibility of what can we start doing on Moccasin Bend to inform people. Do you remember that?
Yes. Yeah.
And we did an app so that people along the Tennessee River Park can actually connect to that app and find out a little bit about how Moccasin Bend was used during the Civil War.
Right. Along the Riverwalk south of downtown, there's the possibility of using the app that Larry mentions to hear part of the Moccasin Bend story. And one of the interesting things about that perspective is that you're looking at the eastern slopes of Stringer's Ridge there across the river. And the 10th Indiana battery guns are on the top of that hill, and then to your left is the northern tip of Lookout Mountain, and you get some sense then of how the guns could fire across. So,
Sir, across the room there?
Quick question, what's the name of that app?
Larry, the name of the app is,
I can't remember.
yeah.
We'll email it out
Yeah.
to everyone who's,
Yeah.
once we get the name.
My question was, do you have any kind of description of how the pontoon bridge was constructed? It seems to be a pretty pivotal role in what you described.
Well, the actual construction of the pontoon bridge at Browns Ferry would have been basically like any other of the pontoon bridges of that Civil War period, whether they were using the true bateau-style boats or even the later canvas boats. The boats would have been anchored side by side to one another. The distance between the boats somewhat dependent upon what it was you were going to cross over the bridge. The heavier the heavier the things that were going to be crossed, the closer the boats needed to be to one another. So the number of boats in a bridge would vary often, and the boats would be anchored side by side, and then what we would think of today as stringers, but what they called balks, would be stretched between the boats, lashed to tie downs on the boats. And then on top of those balks or stringers, they laid the floorboards, what they called chests, and the floorboards were lashed to the balks. This makes for a very flexible structure, and one that you always had to have someone tightening up the ropes or loosening the ropes as water level rose and fell. You might actually have to take or add boats or take boats out. But the construction of the bridge over the river at Browns Ferry, which will be vital for the continuing operation. And I'll be talking about that in the tour that I am doing out on Moccasin Bend on Saturday morning, November the 19th. The bridge had to be maintained continuously because of all of the movement of those components within it. And was susceptible to breakage. The thing that's really unique about the pontoon bridges here at Chattanooga is that the Army of the Cumberland's standard pontoon train was all out at Bridgeport and Stevenson, Alabama. They need the boats here, but they don't have a viable way of getting the boats into Chattanooga, and so they just decide to build more boats in Chattanooga. Perrin Fox, the engineer tasked with doing the work, said, it doesn't really matter what the shape of the boat is, it's got to have a certain buoyancy. And he calculated what the buoyancy is, and he basically made a box with one pointed end to split the current. And so his boats were unique. They're flat-bottomed, 24-inch sides, which he were a single pine plank that cut on one of the two sawmills in Chattanooga. Unfortunately, we don't know many more details about the boats. Fox himself says they were 25 to 30 feet long. 25 is different than 30, so I'd love to know that. In a post-war speech to some veterans, he said, he's describing the boats, and the editors of the speech put in parentheses, and he held up a sketch. I'd love to find the sketch, but it may be no better than the sketches that I've drawn on the back of my file folders for several of you all over the years. So, they were a unique design boat, and the key thing being just simply the buoyancy to support the rest of the structure. So,
Jim, I'm going to read a couple questions
Okay.
quickly from the people joining us online. In the cover photo up now, how does the tip of Moccasin Bend compare to where it is now? We talked about this earlier.
Yes, there is less Moccasin Bend today than there is in this photograph. Yeah, let's see here. Yeah. Of course, we can't see a little bit of the ball of the moccasin there because of Lookout Mountain. But when the Eisenhower National Defense Highway System was planned into Chattanooga, it was decided rather than bridge the Tennessee River twice, as was once proposed, that instead they would take Cameron Hill in Chattanooga, load it into dump trucks, and haul it down here and start dumping it into the Tennessee River in the slough between Ross's Towhead Island and the mainland, and they would build a shelf for I-24 around the base of Lookout Mountain. When I showed that picture earlier of the railroad going past Lookout Mountain, I hope at least some of you all said, well, now wait a minute, the interstate runs there today. Well, yes, on landfill, on Cameron Hill, which was hauled out and dumped into the river. Well, in doing that, they're going to narrow the river up by up to 400 feet. And so they brought a Mississippi River dredge up, and they carved off a corresponding anywhere from 0 to 400 feet of Moccasin Bend, and they pumped it as slurry into the center of the bend. The Tennessee River has literally been moved over up to 400 feet there past the tip of the mountain. And so if you try to line this photograph up with Moccasin Bend today, it's not going to line up exactly because part of the toe, much of the ball, and part of the instep of the bend has been carved off and pumped into the center of Moccasin Bend. And it's worth considering this because what's being talked about in some circles today, the I-24 parking lot. Yeah, how do we get more lanes on I-24? So a little bit of history here. This is a little more recent, but it's another history of Moccasin Bend. So.
Thanks, Jim. And then there's one more on the Q&A. What happened to the man on watch at Brown's Tavern when the U.S. Army came? Did he get away? Did he wake others?
Yeah, Private Payne got away. So, but just one man on duty at that time. So, Well, I do appreciate you all coming out tonight for this program. I appreciate you all supporting National Park Partners and the National Military Park in our efforts to preserve and interpret the history here. And I hope you'll come out for future programs. As Tricia mentioned and as I mentioned, we'll be doing a series of programs on the 19th and 20th of November to recognize the 159th anniversary of the battles for Chattanooga, and then additional programs on the actual anniversary dates, the 23rd, 24th, 25th. They're all on the National Military Parks website, and I suspect Tricia is probably going to send something out as well. So,
Thanks, Jim. Thank you all again for being here, and thank you, Greg, for another fabulous Moccasin Bend lecture series. And with that, we're adjourned.